Throughout history, there are flashpoints, seminal events that seem to those living through them as if life as we know it won't be the same. And then with the passage of time, things pretty much resume to life as we know it. Well, where does COVID fit into this? Experts tell us this time is different. Now, it's challenging to pierce the din of today's public space, the media chatter, the policymakers who are clearly obsessed with the matters at hand, from rebooting economies to overcrowded units in COVID units in hospitals, and of course the search for a vaccine. What we have in store now is a conversation between two individuals who are attempting to rise above that din, to take a hard-nosed look at the other side of COVID-19 and what that world holds. We know that someday lockdowns, masks, and social distancing will end. But what aspects of our lives will be permanently disrupted? I'm now pleased to introduce Dan Senor, who is an investor, who is the co-author of Startup Nation, New York Times bestseller, which has been translated into over 30 languages, and is also the co-founder and board member of Startup Nation Central. I should add, it's not every day that you get to hand the mic over to your little brother. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Wendy. Little brother, younger brother. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a real honor for me to introduce Dr. Summers, who's joining this conversation when Eugene Kendall, Startup Nation Central, and told us that Dr. Summers had agreed to join this conversation. We were thrilled because I think it's easy to get caught up in the sort of minute-to-minute developments that shape the daily headlines of this crisis we're in, but not get the benefit of a longer-term horizon on what this means going forward for years, decades, perhaps generations. And we can't think of anyone better than Larry Summers to help illuminate for us. So he really is someone who needs no introduction. But that said, I will do a brief summary of his introduction. He is the Charles Eliot University professor at Harvard University. He's president emeritus of Harvard University. He was the 27th president of Harvard, and has a long resume in extremely important policymaking roles in the United States government, also at the World Bank, at the United States Treasury, where he served at the sub-cabinet level. He served at the cabinet level. He was Secretary of Treasury from 99 through 2001. In the Clinton administration, he was director of the National Economic Council in the Obama administration, and played a key role there, actually, in the recovery following the global financial crisis. And obviously writes extensively and teaches, and has on many policymakers around the world, let's just say, have him on speed dial. So we're lucky. And most importantly, since this is Startup Nation Central and this is an Israel organization, it's important to mention a little known fact. Most of you know Larry's bio, but what you don't know is he competed in Maccabi ping pong competition in Israel. So not only is he a phenomenal ping pong player, but he is competed at a very elite level. Can we confirm that, Larry, in Israel?
Well, I participated in an elite competition. I didn't necessarily have elite results. It wasn't quite it wasn't quite the equivalent of Eddie the Eagle ski jumping, but I would not say I distinguished myself. And I think I'm fortunate that my day job is in economics rather than in table tennis.
All right. Well, maybe once we get through pandemic and quarantines are lifted, we will get you back to the Holy Land for an elite competition, even if the results will not be necessarily elite. Thanks for being here. Let's jump into the conversation. I want to start really where Wendy left off in her introduction. You wrote recently, in the last few months, an op-ed, a very powerful op-ed for the Financial Times, in which you referred to this crisis as a hinge moment in history. And it's easy to think every moment is a hinge moment. You 2001 after the September 11th attacks, that may have felt like a hinge moment. And indeed, in the moment it did. You said that in 2008, after the global financial crisis, that very much felt like nothing will be the same again. And yet things change. And you say this one really is different. So can you explain both why we thought those ones were different and they may not have been, but this one is the exception?
So I don't want to completely minimize the sense in which there will be aspects of life that will get back to normal, just as happened after the financial crisis and just as happened after 9/11. I think in the case of 9/11, somehow the problem was brought under control more effectively than people imagined. If it had been the case that there were going to be multiple terrorist attacks on major capital cities around the world of large scale going forward, I think the world would have changed much more than it did. In fact, there's been nothing 10% as large as 9/11 in the United States or in Western Europe in the years since 9/11. And that would have seemed extremely unlikely to people at the time of 9/11. It seems to me that the COVID crisis is important for itself. It's a pandemic that's going to kill a huge number of people around the world. It's going to leave a large number of people with real health damage. It's been a tremendous source of anxiety and a tremendous source of economic dislocation. And all of that has continuing effects. But I think the larger significance of COVID is that it is going to reinforce what were already profound structural changes in the global economy. It's going to reinforce what I think is a move away from the Reagan-Thatcher individualism ethos that has dominated politics for the last 40 years. It's pretty clear that getting people tested, getting people quarantined, getting contacts traced, developing a vaccine, disseminating a vaccine, finding a cure, providing care for the afflicted, it's pretty clear that these are central public responsibilities that can't simply be met by decentralized markets. And there are more and more of those with rising inequality, with the challenge of climate change. So I think the first major aspect of this is that it marks a defining recognition that we've shifted towards a more public sector orientation and less ideology of the individual market. I think the second really sea change is in the complexity of what it means for our politics and democracies under challenge. You know, Abraham Lincoln famously spoke about government by the people and government for the people. And we tend to take it as axiomatic that government by the people will be government for the people. But if one looks at some of the difficulties that democracies have had in competently managing COVID in the United States, in parts of Southern Europe, in Brazil, in India, that is an increasing question. And the set of issues surrounding people's disillusionment, their election of populist leaders who profess to be committed to acting in their interest, who are in fact rather ineffective in that regard, but the response is to call forth even more populism. I think the threat of populism and democratic dysfunctionality is something that is very, very strong right now, and whose significance is being magnified by COVID. I think there is a profound acceleration of trends towards decentralization associated with information technology. Just a year ago, I would have had a choice whether I wanted to participate in this important conversation. I did. Whether I was able and willing to take several days out of my life to come to Israel in order to do it, which, given my teaching responsibilities, might have been difficult. This is accelerating the moves towards information technology. My wife and I have decided that we will spend a larger fraction of each year in our home in Cape Cod, because we've seen what it was like from our experiences of the last few months. Companies are increasingly recognizing that they can ask their workers to work at home and economize on real estate costs. People are increasingly realizing that delivered goods are often pretty good goods. Some of that will reverse itself for sure, and people will go back to old ways, but I don't think 100% of it will reverse itself. And so I think we're seeing 5 to 10 years progress in the acceleration of information technologies application in a year. And I think that will have durable effect. And I think the fourth aspect is that this is bringing into very high relief issues between China and the United States. China, on the one hand, was clearly slower than it should have been to recognize the gravity of the problem, to take strong measures, and to contribute to the global effort to contain the virus. On the other hand, it has to be said that life is far more normal today in Beijing or Shanghai than it is in New York or London or Paris at this point. And that has to carry with it some set of implications for what increasingly appears to be an ongoing struggle between the United States and China. So I think that these four developments go beyond the immediate impact of the crisis. And that's why I think it's substantially more likely that when history is written in 2100, that 2020 will loom as a crucial date, then I think it's likely that 2001 will loom as a crucial date, or then it is that 2008 will loom as a crucial date.
So let me pick up on where you spoke about China. We were already seeing before this crisis, as you alluded to, decoupling may be too strong a term, but there was this growing separation or serious questions about whether or not there should be a separation or some kind of at least in certain sectors. We are already starting to see it in the tech sector of our respective economies. Do you see a dramatic acceleration of that coming out of COVID? And in what other areas, like global supply chains, won't just be tech, global potentially around medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, and some of the very ingredients we need right now to fight this pandemic or future pandemics, we're very dependent on China. So just trying to think about all the ways decoupling decoupling, or is there a lot of hype around it, and there'll be kind of a calming down effect once we get through the pandemic?
I think it's hard to know with any high degree of confidence how this is going to play out, Dan. My sense is that there's been a considerable erosion of the constituencies for comity on both sides. That in the United States, the business community, which had been a strong advocate for a strong relationship and benign relationship with China, has become disillusioned with the Chinese market opportunity and has become discredited in any event by widening inequality in the United States. I think in China, a younger generation is increasingly impatient for China to find its place in the world, is increasingly proud of what China has accomplished, and is less and less patient and tolerant of what is seen as America's arrogance. And so I think the forces are not moving in constructive directions. On top of that, I think if we had a decade of emphasis on globalization and just in time, we may be headed towards a decade of just in case and localization in terms of the preferences of governments, in terms of corporate strategies, in terms of the flows of people across international borders. So I can't predict what's going to happen to TikTok or what's going to happen to Huawei, but we basically shed the idea for 25 years between 1990 and 2015. We basically shed the idea that good fences make good neighbors in favor of the idea that no fences make close relationships. And I think we're headed into a broad era in which good fences make good neighbors is going to be a much more prevalent ideology. And nowhere is that more true than between the United States and China. I don't think we're going to see some kind of ultimate convergence of the kind that many people felt they were able to foresee several decades ago. The magnetism of the success of the American model is greatly diminished by all that's happened in the last 2 decades. And for all their problems, I think the Chinese see a very, very important moment of opportunity in this juncture. And so I would expect that you're certainly going to see further decoupling.
As it relates to the public equity markets, this is something that's followed by obviously policymakers. It's followed by obviously many players in the tech scene, in the venture tech scene, in the Israeli venture tech scene, because many of them depend heavily on exits into the public equity markets, into particularly the NASDAQ in the case of most of the Israeli tech scene. So on the one hand, there's you read the report, the public reports, and the hysteria is that the U.S. economy is experiencing some kind of catastrophe. We could debate what that catastrophe is and whether it's a sub catastrophe or a catastrophe times two, or it's getting better or it's not getting better, but things are bad, and yet the public equity markets are more or less on a tear, and so there seems to be this discrepancy. So what how do you explain that? And I know you've made the point that after 1929 we had like 5 rallies in the stock market that were 25% or higher. So it's not unheard of for there to be market rallies in a period of crisis. Um, is that one of those moments? Are we in one of those moments right now, or is there really just a big disconnect between the two?
Yeah, I think in general, the evidence is overwhelming that average investors have lost far more money panicking and selling on dips than they have lost holding on for too long during periods that ultimately turned out to be downturns. So I think people who are panicking and selling over the events in the last few days are most likely making a significant mistake. Dan, I've somewhat, as I've analyzed this further over the last few months, changed my mind. I do not advise my 95-year-old mother that she should be diversifying out of stocks right now, despite what I know about the discrepancy you mentioned between the apparent recession and the level of the stock market. And here's how I would think about it. 30 to 40% of the stock market, depending on how you count, is companies that are probably benefiting from COVID. Big tech companies, healthcare companies, telecommunications companies. And they are very substantially up, and they're up with a lot of good reason around their increasing productivity and increasing market size. Think of it as the Zoom sector. The remainder of the market, 60% of the market, is down perhaps 10 or 15%. How should one think about that 15%? Well, interest rates are down by 1%, real interest rates. Long-term real interest rates are down by 1%. And so, other things equal, that should lead to an increase in stock prices of perhaps 20%. So the lower interest rates should be a 15 to 20% tailwind. The reality is that the markets are down 15 to 20%. And so in toto, the market is predicting that cash flows are down by 30%. Well, is that reasonable? Certainly cash flows are likely to be down by more than 30% this year, and maybe they're going to be down by more than 30% next year. But I don't think there's a particular reason to think that they're going to be down by 30% 5 years from now. And so if you look at it in that way, you would say that 30% as the average long-term cash flows generated by typical companies doesn't seem like a crazy kind of number. Or here's another way to put it. If you look at stock prices, the largest companies have done the best. The medium-sized companies have done the second best, and the small companies have done the worst in the post-COVID period. If you ask about the economy contains a very large number of private enterprises that are too small or too private to be on the stock market. Their fair value has probably moved with small companies rather than with the mega caps. And so another way to think about it is that the stock market is only reflecting a slice of the economy, and it's very disproportionately reflecting what has been the most fortunate slice of the economy.
So let's talk a little bit about a couple of sectors that you know a lot about that could be headed for fundamental change and fundamental change for the better, or this is an opportunity for real innovation. So I want to talk specifically about education and the future of university education. And I just want to refer to this interview. Scott Galloway from NYU gave an interview to New York Magazine, and he says, he said in the interview, there's a recognition that education, the value, the price, the product has fundamentally shifted. The value of education has been substantially degraded because of COVID. There's the education certification, and then there's the experience of college. The experience part of it is down to zero, and the education part has been dramatically reduced. You get a degree that over time will be reduced in value as we realize it is not the same to be a graduate of a liberal college if you never go to campus. And he goes on to compare what we're going through now to department stores in 2018, which is to say, if in 2018 department stores didn't all collapse at once, but you had the feel that many of them were becoming zombie stores. And are we entering an era of zombie universities, given that people can't go to them? And yet, does that also create opportunities through what you're talking about a minute ago, the sort of the Zoom generation, to actually reach more people through university than has never reached before? How do you see all this playing out?
Dan, nobody knows. I think you have to kind of keep your time horizon straight. I would be quite surprised and disappointed if next fall college campuses aren't at least 80% of the way back to the way they were in 2019. That is, students are living in dorms, they're having parties with each other, they're having football games, their bands are playing at the football games, professors are teaching, lecturing students in person, students are part of musical groups and school newspapers and whatnot. I'd be pretty surprised if by next fall we hadn't substantially normalized. And I'd be extremely surprised if we hadn't normalized a year after that. So I think it's true that the current situation, which is people charging high tuition and regular tuition of a kind that goes with the high touch experience on college campuses, and providing Zoom equivalents. I agree with Professor Galloway that that's probably untenable, but that doesn't seem to me to be the likely question. I think the question that's really raised, and I'm not sure that I see for sure the evidence that the value of a good liberal arts education is necessarily declining. I meet a lot of people who want people who can write a coherent paragraph, who want people who can marshal their ideas and organize them and speak about them fluently. I suspect that a certain amount of what was the drone work in investment banking or in engineering is increasingly going to be taken over by software, and those who have the capacity to interact may become more valuable with the passage of time rather than less valuable. So I don't buy the thesis about the end of liberal arts. What I think is true is that there may be some important reorganization around the way education happens. Is it really the best way for there to be several thousand lectures given each fall on the plays of Shakespeare? Or would it be better if the best lecturers with extensive support of various kinds produce lectures that not tens, not hundreds, but thousands of people watched, and that other faculty were engaged much more directly in dialogue and communication with students. You know, higher education is an odd industry. An institution as successful as Harvard or Yale or Princeton, in almost any other industry, would have grown much more rapidly over the last 50 years than Harvard, Yale, or Princeton have grown. Universities have a tendency to define their specialness by the number of people they exclude, how hard it is to get in, rather than by their scale and the number of people they include. And I think the
Yeah, it's like it's
financial
what Peter
pressures
Thiel
to
calls the
come,
rope line
the
effect.
greater
in front of a
efficacy
club.
of IT will help to solve that problem.
Before we move to the journalists who we have ready to ask questions, I want to ask you about healthcare, because overnight, like you said, through Zoom, you know, a year ago or 6 months ago, you would have had to spend days traveling to Israel to appear at these series of lectures or series of conversations if you wanted to participate, and now you like flip a switch and you're on your computer in Cape Cod. So healthcare is going through a similar transformation, digital health, telemedicine. We've had in the developing world huge swaths of the world that don't really have access to quality healthcare providers, and the same is true even in the United States. We've had, you know, healthcare deserts. We are now, like I said, overnight, people are now addressing their healthcare by looking into a screen or looking into a phone. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is that one of the things that's here to stay? What does it mean for healthcare as we know it?
My guess, Dan, is that probably is here to stay, but it's not going to be the largest part of healthcare expenditures that are going to be changed. But I think the practice of primary care is going to be profoundly altered by the virtual house call. And it's not the same as you go into the office. It's not the same as the doctor coming to your house. It's a different kind of hybrid. And I think primary healthcare will be very importantly affected, particularly in remote areas. My guess is that if we look back 25 years from now and we decide that healthcare has been completely transformed, it is more likely that healthcare will have been completely transformed by the advent of sensors of various kinds that will be continuously monitoring for problems and continually delivering various kinds of cures, medicines into your bloodstreams and the like. And my guess is it will be sensing technology, sensing and measuring technology combined with infusion of medicine technology combined with artificial intelligence that will produce the largest change if medicine is profoundly transformed in the next 30 years. I'm not at all sure that innovation will prove to reduce the total cost of medical care rather than providing more opportunities to make people's lives better, increase the increase the quantity of resources that society devotes to medical care. But I think that's okay, because I think for most of us, there's nothing more fundamental than our health.
We have, I could go on with many more questions. I hope to have time to squeeze one more in before we end. Before I do that, I want to welcome some of the journalists who have questions. The first is Steve Shear from Reuters, who is going to ask you a question. Steve, you on?
I am on. I actually, thank you very much. This was a very interesting, insightful talk. I actually had two questions. I only had originally one, and now I have two. But then none of them are COVID related. So the first one has to do with how do you see the Israel normalization with the UAE as affecting the economy? Is that something you could speak on, either one of you?
Why don't you
Larry,
ask
go ahead.
both your questions?
My second question is, the Israel and China have been have very good ties for a long time. And now the United States has pretty much made Israel choose us or them. And now Israel has to backtrack a little on their Chinese ties. How do you feel about that situation? That Israel has to back away from China?
I think in general, the United States is going to do better as a secure partner rather than as a jealous and insecure partner. And the United States may be able to get Israel to move away from China. But I think as a general strategy for the United States, forcing countries to choose between China and the US is unlikely to be a wise one. It's likely to be a maximally pointed issue in Asia. And in Asia, I'm not sure that all the countries will make, from our point of view, the right choice. So I'm pretty unenthusiastic about the force them to choose strategy. I'm not really in a position to knowledgeably assess the UAE deal in terms of its economic consequences for Israel. I do think that anything that tends to be normalizing, conflict reducing, and securing of Israel's future is likely to reduce risk premia and therefore to encourage investment and economic growth in Israel.
Yeah. Before we move on, Steve, I would just add to that last point. I mean, one of the motivations when I talked to Emirati officials over the years and Emirati investors, getting access to the Israeli tech scene and the Israeli innovation economy was a big motive for their path to soft normalization, quiet normalization, meaning unofficial normalization, which, as you know, has been going on for some time. Now we have real normalization. And so that allows them to do their engagement with Israel's tech economy and their potential investing in the Israeli tech economy in the open. And to the extent that Israel is just the first among the Sunni Gulf countries, you could see more normalization across more countries and more of this chasing in a good way, in a healthy way, for Israeli tech and Israeli innovation solutions from the Sunni Gulf. And they have considerable resources and considerable problems to solve. So to Larry's point, I think it could only be a positive. Let's move to Ivan Livingston from Bloomberg. Hey, Ivan, how are you? Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you, Dan. And thanks, Larry, for doing this. Also, I found it all very interesting. And I wanted to ask a question. In America, everyone is very focused, of course, on the election there, and also abroad. Many of the people I speak to are starting to think about what November means for them and holding off on decision making. And I was curious, how strong the implication, I guess, do you think the presidential election in November will have on kind of long-term economic trends? How important is it?
I think it's probably the most important US presidential election in my lifetime. I think there's a normal and general tendency to, especially in election years, overstate the importance of US elections because much of history is shaped by broad forces that aren't dependent on which individual becomes president. It was Richard Nixon, the Cold Warrior, who went to China. Richard Nixon, the conservative, who introduced environmental protection legislation at the federal level. It was the Democrat Bill Clinton who declared that the era of big government is over. Much is driven by general tides. That said, I think President Trump represents an aberration from the American tradition of presidential leadership in his disdain for the idea that there exists a community of nations who it's the United States' job to promote and for the last century lead in the world, in favor of a view of international life as an atavistic struggle between rivals for immediate commercial advantage. I think there is a broad tradition of the goal of broad social inclusion where everyone has a chance in the United States. To be sure, there are differences in the political parties and the extent to which they believe that preferences are an important tool of policy and what the best approach is. But no previous president, speaking as president, has engaged in the kind of clear appeals to racism that have been a consistent pattern with President Trump and with very substantial consequences. I think presidents in general have had respect for expertise and for the responsibility of their office and the dignity of our nation. And if you take the spectacle of a president of the United States talking about injecting bleach to solve COVID, or saying that soldiers who were killed were suckers and losers for having given up their lives, you are talking about something that is really very aberrant. I think that it can happen that elections have outcomes and people get results from elections that aren't the ones they expected or the ones they wanted. And so I think the world is prepared to be quite understanding of the United States if it moves past this moment. As Winston Churchill is said to have said, the United States always does the right thing, but only after exhausting the alternatives. But if President Trump were to be reelected, the American people, having seen the last 4 years, having experienced the incredible coarsening of all of our public discourse, I think that will cast a very long and very dark shadow for people around the world, for people who have been disadvantaged within the United States, for people who have seen America as an exemplar of values of reason, fairness, and decency. So I think these stakes are very high in a way that goes beyond the usual conflict between Democrats and Republicans.
Dr. Moore from Mariv.
The marker, Haaretz.
The marker.
Thank you very much.
Mixing up my Israeli newspapers. Sorry about that.
Okay. I'd like to refer the question to Professor Summers. COVID-19 has further exposed the inequalities in the US. You just mentioned some of what the president did. And how much money influences distribution and wealth as well as policy. Now, would you agree that in some ways money in politics has shifted the balance of power from the working class, from the middle class to the investor class, or to the big money, maybe damaged social mobility? And if so, what could balance the scales once again, other than something like a violent revolution?
I'd like to see some reduction of the extreme influence of money in politics. That said, I think it's important to recognize that a very substantial fraction of people who carry a lunch pail to work voted for Donald Trump. I think it's important to recognize that Joe Biden has considerably more money for his campaign than Donald Trump does in 2020. I think it's less clear that the schisms are really driven by money rather than by cultural values. Would I like to see a repeal of the so-called Citizens United decision that said that corporations could contribute money to political campaigns? Yes, I don't think corporations should have First Amendment rights to free speech. Would I like to see more requirements around transparency of people who contribute money to political causes? Yes, that is something that I'd like to see. Would I like to see much greater focus on the various ways in which President Trump is using his office to enrich himself and his friends? Yes, I would very much like to see that as well. But as I think about the problems of American politics, I don't think the main reason we have widening inequality is because of campaign contributions given by rich people. I think it has much more to do with deep structural forces in the economy that are leading it to be worthwhile to pay a small number of individuals a very large amount of money, and firms are then making that kind of choice. And so I would much prefer a strategy for equality and opportunity that was based upon prudent public expenditure and that was based on progressive taxation and that was supported even by the most fortunate in terms of their long-term enlightened self-interest, than conceptualizing the problem largely through the issue of campaign finance.
We have a question from Simon from the Financial Times. Simon, you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Hello.
Right.
My question is about developing economies.
Simon Cooper from the FT.
Yeah. Developing economies, obviously, there's been a big hit to these economies from the COVID lockdowns, less so from people dying of the disease in many countries, except Brazil, India. Longer term, how do you see this hinge events, as you've called it, changing the trajectory of developing economies?
You know, one of the really profound changes that historians will look back at for the era of globalization that began in about 1980 was that it was the moment when the presumption became convergence of developing economies and industrial economies. When the normal expectation was you'd look at the IMF outlook and whatever that year was the forecast of growth for industrial countries, it would be something a few percent more rapidly for developing countries. I think the combination of a low commodity price environment the difficulties and the strains put on government by COVID, the substantially less globalized trade environment that we're likely to have, the reduction in migrant flows and reductions in immigration, the increasing burden of debt and limitations on the willingness to provide new credit. I think all of that makes it much less than a sure bet that that progress of convergence is going to continue. And what would be a truly hinge event would be if we went from a converging planet to a diverging planet.
Larry, we've gotten some questions from the audience that I'm going to put one to you about the future of cities, which is a big deal for Israel. Obviously, the role that Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in particular, and even some smaller cities play as population centers in the tech ecosystem as clusters is extraordinary. And obviously, the US experience with these city clusters, these urban clusters. So the question from the audience is, do you see a mass reversal from net migration into cities globally? What changes to the ecosystem of cities would result? And will cities be a less rich and desirable place to live and work in the future? So any one of those, there's a few questions embedded there.
I think I think the broad global trend towards movement away from rural areas towards urban areas, I would be quite surprised and very disappointed if that trend did not continue. I think that the mega cities of the world have benefited from the immense economies of agglomeration that come from bringing elites together. And I think the trifecta of less work in the same building because of COVID and because of what people have now seen is possible. More desire to be insulated from more people and the consequent lack of excitement about surging crowds and comfort in attending great plays or great restaurants or whatever. And the associated loss of tax base and difficulty of providing the high quality services that elites want mean that there may well be a substantial secession of the successful from cities. And if there is the risk of a doom cycle in which lower tax bases lead to less attractive cities, lead to further exit and lower tax bases. And so I am concerned when I think about the future of New York City that the inconsistent updraft that I would have described as the likely pattern 2 years ago now looks far from certain to me. And I would imagine that things of that kind will be replicated elsewhere.
Before we wrap, one question. You've said in some of your own interviews I've seen of you, that there in these crises, it's easy to have a very dark view. It's easy to spell out how bad things and how permanently bad things can get. But the reality is there is this sort of self-correcting system that kicks in societies, even as some could argue as dysfunctional as the US society right now. Can you just talk a little about that? How you kind of hang on to some optimism, that almost the default to go to a very dark place is the easy thing to do, but it's actually not the most reliable?
I think there are broad trends of scientific progress, of enhanced human connection due to information technology, of extended sympathy as people know more of each other and know more of people further away, that point in positive directions. And I think there's a tendency for those trends, which are not news at any one moment, to cumulatively and over time exceed the adverse impacts of particular events, even massive events like COVID. So I would describe myself as someone who is optimistic about progress, but whose optimism depends on a judgment about the United States and even the world, but particularly the United States, having a remarkable capacity for self-denying prophecy, having a capacity to generate jeremiads of alarm that then call forth various responses that in the end keep the peace. Take, for example, the period from 1950 to 1990. In many ways, because of the specter of nuclear war between the two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, that could have literally killed hundreds of millions of people, if not extinguished life on Earth. It was the greatest moment of fear in human history. But it was managed. It was managed in part because many, many people were aware of how scary it was and the need for arms control, the need for negotiation, the need for finding ways of moving forward. And that challenge was met. And if you looked at how people lived in 1990, it was in so many ways better than the way they had lived in 1950. So ultimately, I believe that warnings and alarm are highly constructive and are necessary, and that the moment we become complacent, we will rue the outcomes. But equally, if you step back from it all, I think President Kennedy said something very profound when he said, man's problems were made by man. It follows that they can be solved by man.
All right. Well, on that upbeat note, I want to thank Dr. Summers for joining us today. Hopefully, next time we will post pandemic sometime in the future. Hopefully, not too distant future. We'll get you to Tel Aviv for an in-person conference and perhaps some ping pong. And until then,
I will look forward to, I will look
week.
forward to that, Dan. And let me just thank you for this immensely thoughtful interview. Thank you for what I learned from your book about Israel and about issues of technology more broadly, and express my very strong desire to have an opportunity to visit again in Israel sometime before too long.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Larry. And thanks everyone for joining us. Just one housekeeping note. We'll see you everyone else tomorrow for the closing session of the New Digital Age Week. The session will be live at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and we will be discussing the new normal of selected industries. So that's tomorrow, Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the New Digital Age closing session, where we'll deal with the new normal for select industries. Until then, have a safe and healthy afternoon and evening, depending on where you are. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.